I experienced something truly terrifying a few weeks ago. I bought a vacation home in the Hudson Valley, an old, creaky shack on a couple of acres of isolated land. Meant to be a peaceful retreat from the city, but my experience has turned into a nightmare that I can't shake off. When I first moved in, my family helped me set up. During one of our trips back and forth from the furniture store, we met Dale, the closest neighbor. He seemed like a typical local with his thick Hudson Valley accent. At first he was friendly, though there was something a bit off about him. We exchanged pleasantries and went about our business, thinking nothing of it. A couple of weeks later, I returned alone to continue settling in. Dale showed up again, uninvited. He invited me for a beer, which I reluctantly accepted. As we sat on his deck, he seemed to become increasingly agitated. The conversation quickly turned into a heated argument about city folk ruining the area. His ranting and the way he looked at me made me uncomfortable. When I left, he called out an awkward apology, which did nothing to ease my growing unease. That night, as I lay on a mattress on the floor, I heard a disembodied voice outside, cursing and muttering. I peered out the window, but the darkness swallowed everything. I was too scared to check, so I stayed put, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or some other benign explanation. The next day, Dale knocked incessantly on my door. His persistence and the fact that he knew my car was there freaked me out. I avoided answering, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was lurking nearby, waiting to catch me. Later that night, as I watched TV, I heard that same voice again. This time, I saw Dale standing just beyond the deck light. He froze for a moment, then darted into the woods. My heart raced as I considered calling the police, but I hesitated, fearing the consequences of involving law enforcement. Trying to sleep, I was jolted awake by Dale's furious shouting outside. "Silly piece of shit, I know you're in there. Leave, no one wants you here." His words were filled with rage and malice, confirming my worst fears. I packed up and left the next day, vowing never to return alone. But the scary part? When I went back to check on the property a few weeks later, I found something that made my blood run cold. Dale's mobile home was gone. The yard was eerily quiet. The scariest thing I discovered was an old, dusty journal hidden in a hollow tree near the edge of the woods. The entries were disturbing, describing detailed plans to welcome newcomers in unsettling ways. The last entry, written in a frantic scrawl, read, "I'll make sure no one leaves once they step onto my land." I can't shake the feeling that something terrible happened there. And Dale might not be finished with his dark plans. My advice? If you ever hear strange noises at night, just remember, sometimes it's not just the wind. And don't be too quick to trust your neighbors. The eeriness of the place only deepened with time. One evening, while going through old boxes in the attic, I found an old, tarnished locket. Inside was a photograph of a young woman with an inscription. "To my dearest Dale, Love, M." The locket felt cold and heavy in my hand, and a chill ran down my spine as I realized it belonged to Dale's late wife, who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. Townsfolk whispered about her, but no one ever found out what really happened. The nights grew longer and more terrifying. The noises outside became more persistent. Footsteps crunching on gravel, whispers in the wind, and the occasional thud against the walls. One night, I woke up to the sound of scratching at the window. I mustered the courage to look, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. Dale's face was pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking, twisted smile on his lips. He mouthed something I couldn't hear, but the menace in his expression was unmistakable. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, and grabbed my phone to call the police. When the officers arrived, Dale was gone. They took my statement but seemed skeptical, attributing my experience to an overactive imagination. They assured me they would keep an eye on the property, but I could tell they didn't believe me. As they left, one officer turned back and said, "Be careful around here. There are things in these woods that are best left undisturbed." Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I began researching the history of the area and found that my property had a dark past. It was once the site of a small settlement that vanished without a trace in the early 1900s. The settlers were rumored to have dabbled in dark rituals, and many believed the land was cursed. The more I learned, the more I understood the depth of the malevolent force that seemed to hang over the place. One particularly stormy night, as the wind howled and rain lashed against the windows, I heard a faint, rhythmic chanting. It seemed to come from all around, echoing through the trees and filling the air with a sense of dread. I followed the sound to the edge of the woods, where I found Dale, standing in a clearing, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the ground. He held a lantern in one hand and a knife in the other, eyes wild with madness. He was chanting in a language I couldn't understand, and the air seemed to thrum with dark energy. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps, and ran back to the house. I locked the doors and windows, but the chanting continued, growing louder and more insistent. I felt a heavy weight pressing down on me, as if the very air was thick with malevolence. The symbols carved into the clearing began to glow with an eerie light, casting long, twisted shadows that danced and writhed in the darkness. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of the room, clutching a flashlight and a kitchen knife, listening to the relentless chant and the whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. The darkness outside felt alive, pulsing with a malevolent intent. I knew that Dale was trying to draw me out, to pull me into whatever dark ritual he was performing. Morning came, but the sense of dread didn't lift. I decided it was time to leave for good. As I packed my things, I heard a knock on the door. I froze, my heart racing. The knock came again, louder and more insistent. I slowly approached the door and peeked through the peephole. To my horror, it was Dale, standing there with that same twisted smile. "I know you're in there," he said softly, his voice dripping with malice. "You can't hide forever." I didn't answer. I backed away, my mind racing with fear. Dale began to pound on the door, his voice rising in a frenzied chant. The windows rattled and the walls seemed to close in around me. I grabbed my bag and made a dash for the back door, slipping out into the pouring rain. I ran through the woods, the branches clawing at my clothes and the mud sucking at my feet. I could hear Dale's voice behind me, growing fainter but no less menacing. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where I flagged down a passing car. The driver, a kindly old man, took one look at my terrified face and didn't ask any questions. He drove me to the nearest town, where I contacted my family and made arrangements to sell the property. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that house. The journal, the locket, the chanting, all of it haunts my nightmares. I've moved far away, but I can't shake the feeling that Dale is still out there, watching and waiting. So if you ever find yourself in the Hudson Valley, be wary of the local. And if you hear strange noises at night, remember, sometimes it's not just the wind. Something deeply unsettling with our new neighbor. We had recently moved to a quieter part of town, and when a new face showed up next door, we were hopeful for a change. At first, everything seemed normal, just another van in the driveway. Something felt off from the start. My wife and I decided to introduce ourselves, but no one answered our knock, even though their car was there. We brushed it off. Perhaps they were busy or asleep. Our bedroom is upstairs, and from one of our windows, we had a clear view into the neighbor's backyard. One night, while we were reading in bed, we heard the garage door open. Curious, we peered out and saw the new neighbor, a middle-aged man in a white t-shirt, carrying boxes from his van into the garage. The motion light over his garage was on, so we got a good look at him. Nothing seemed unusual until it did. Days later, we heard the garage door open again in the middle of the night. There were strange scraping and banging sounds, but what really got to me was the constant metallic scraping. I went to the window to see if I could figure out what was going on, and that's when he looked up and caught me staring. Quickly shut the garage door. Feeling awkward, I decided to go over and introduce myself. I walked next door in my shorts and t-shirt, only to find him sitting in his van with the engine running. As soon as he saw me, he backed out of the driveway and sped away. This behavior was unnerving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was deliberately avoiding us. Later that night, I heard my wife whispering that she thought she heard our backyard gate open. I checked, and although I couldn't see anything, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The neighbor's van was parked outside, but no sign of the man. I went to the backyard, turned on the lights, and heard running footsteps. Someone was definitely there. I chased them, but it was just me in the dark street, feeling eyes on me from every direction. The next morning, I spoke with our neighbor Gene, who said he'd heard similar noises from the new guy's garage and found it unsettling. We agreed to keep in touch and investigate together if things got worse. The following Saturday, while I was opening the blinds, I saw the neighbor's car in the driveway. I looked up and saw him standing at one of the windows, staring directly at me. He didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. I waved, but he didn't acknowledge me. My wife and I went over to his house again, but he didn't answer the door, despite a loud slam from inside. That evening, Gene showed me a text he had sent the night before, about hearing muffled crying sounds coming from the direction of the neighbor's house. We all felt a growing sense of unease. The next day, the neighbor's van was gone, and it hasn't returned since. We've heard noises outside at night, and sometimes we think we hear something alive in that garage. Gene's reports of muffled crying only add to the tension. We don't know where he went or when, if ever, he'll come back. But here's the truly horrifying part. Last night, while trying to calm myself, I checked my old camera footage and found something chilling. There, clear as day, was the neighbor standing in the driveway, but he wasn't alone. Next to him were what looked like several people, all huddled and moving in jerky, unnatural ways. The footage ended abruptly with a scream and then silence. So I have to ask, what if your neighbor wasn't who you thought they were? What if they were hiding something far more sinister? If this story gave you chills, make sure to like, subscribe, and share.